It wasn't a scream that ended Thanksgiving dinner, it was a notification chime. My sister Brittany had snatched my iPad off the table to check a vegan stuffing recipe, but she didn't find ingredients. She found a bank alert. Proof of funds verified $12 million. Auction lot 492 pending. The room went so quiet you could hear the gravy congealing. I reached out to take it back, but my mother Susan slammed her hand down on the table. She didn't look shocked, she looked hungry. Well, thank God, she said, smoothing her napkin. Now you can finally fund your sister's lifestyle brand launch. She wasn't asking, she was allocating. Drop a comment below and tell me if your family found out you had $12 million, would they be happy for you, or would they ask for a cut? I'm genuinely curious to read your answers. My mother's voice faded into the background noise, a frequency I had learned to tune out years ago. To them, I was Olivia the cellar rat. The disappointment. The daughter who spent her weekends in damp, climate-controlled warehouses instead of chasing engagement metrics on social media. While Brittany was curating her aesthetic, I was curating assets. They saw the dirt under my fingernails and assumed I was digging my own grave. They didn't understand that the dust on my hands was worth more than the gold plating on Brittany's lease to own jewelry. I looked down at my hands resting on the tablecloth. These hands had held bottles of 1945 Romane Conti that cost more than my parents' entire retirement fund. I wasn't just a broker, I was a ghost in the high-stakes world of vintage wine investment. I tracked auctions in Hong Kong while my family slept. I authenticated corks with a microscope while Brittany learned TikTok dances. I lived in a world of absolute precision, where a single degree of temperature fluctuation could cost a fortune. Grandma Beatrice was the only one who understood. She was the silent matriarch, the woman who sat in the corner at parties watching everyone with sharp, assessing eyes. She was the one who taught me the most important lesson of my life. Value, she used to say, tapping a dusty bottle of Chateau Margaux is often hidden under dirt. If it shines too bright, Olivia, it is usually fake. She taught me that real power doesn't need to announce itself. Real power waits. That was why I never told them. For 5 years, I let them believe I was barely scraping by. I let them make jokes about my little hobby and my dusty bottles. I watched them praise Brittany for getting 1,000 likes on a selfie, while I quietly closed a deal that netted me $180,000 in profit. I didn't hide my wealth because I was ashamed. I hid it because I was strategic. Construction in silence is the only way to build something that lasts. If you build a castle in plain sight of barbarians, they don't admire the architecture. They burn it down to warm themselves. I knew my family. I knew that their love was conditional, based entirely on what they could extract. My silence wasn't fear, it was a firewall. I didn't hide my light because I was afraid to shine. I hid it to protect it from the wind. And in this family, their greed was a hurricane that would have stripped my vines bare before the grapes even had a chance to ripen. So, while Susan planned how to spend my money on a studio rental for Brittany, I wasn't panicking. I was doing what I always did. I was assessing the risk. I was calculating the leverage. And I was realizing that the investment I had made in this family, the patience, the loyalty, the silence, was a sunk cost. They saw a lottery ticket sitting at their table. I saw the return on investment for 10 years of cold hard discipline. And I knew with the certainty of a master appraiser that it was time to liquidate the asset. Back at the dinner table, the silence didn't last. It was broken by the scraping of silverware and the clearing of throats as my family recalibrated. They weren't embarrassed that they had been caught snooping. They were adjusting their strategy. They were shifting from dismissal to extraction. My father Scott wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, a gesture he used to signal that a lecture was incoming. He didn't look at me with pride. He looked at me with the expectancy of a landlord who had just found a tenant hoarding cash in the walls. Olivia, he began, his voice taking on that heavy paternal cadence he reserved for when he wanted something. We need to talk about stewardship. It is a blessing that you have stumbled into this money. We don't need to discuss how or why right now, though I assume it involved a lot of luck. What matters is what you do with it. This family has supported you for 29 years. We put a roof over your head. We tolerated your lack of direction. Now, it is time for you to do your duty. He didn't ask. He didn't inquire. He simply opened the door for Brittany to walk through. My sister didn't hesitate. She had recovered from her shock and replaced it with a terrifying sense of entitlement. She pulled up the notes app on her phone. Okay, so I've been looking at this loft in Soho for the brand headquarters, she said, scrolling rapidly. The rent is $22,000 a month, but we need to pay a year upfront to secure it. And I need a production team for the Bali content trip next month. Oh, and the G-Wagon. I can't show up to meetings in an Uber Live. It's bad for the brand image. She wasn't asking for a loan. She was presenting an invoice, a bill for a life she hadn't earned. I watched them, fascinated by the mechanics of their delusion. For years I had wondered why they bet everything on Brittany. She had no work ethic, no skill set, and no plan. But as I watched Susan nod along to Brittany's demands, adding that we should probably budget for a personal assistant, I finally understood the curse of the golden child. They didn't just love Brittany, they were invested in her. She was their vanity project. If Brittany succeeded, it validated their parenting. It proved that their shallow values, image, fame, loudness were correct. My success, on the other hand, was an insult. I had succeeded without them using values they despised: patience, silence, and intellect. My wealth was a mirror reflecting their incompetence. They couldn't celebrate me because they had no part in making me. So they had to correct the error. They had to take my resources, the fruit of the tree they had rejected, and graft them onto the tree they had planted. They didn't just want my money, they wanted my submission to fund their delusion. They needed to strip me of my power to prop up the hollow idol they had built in Brittany. If they could use my $12 million to make Brittany famous, they could rewrite history. They could claim that the family was successful and that I was just the financier, the silent partner, the wallet. "We'll need access to the funds by Monday," Scott said, pouring himself more wine that I knew was corked, though he didn't have the palate to taste it. "I'll have my accountant draw up the transfer paperwork. We'll put it in a family trust to ensure it's managed properly. You don't know how to handle this kind of capital, Olivia. You'll just let it sit there. We'll put it to work." Managed properly. The words hung in the air, heavy with irony. This coming from a man who had leveraged his own home 3 times to pay for Brittany's failed acting classes and influencer boot camps. They were looking at a shark and telling her she didn't know how to swim. I took a slow sip of water. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table. I just looked at them, cataloging their greed like flaws in a diamond. They truly believed I was going to hand it over. They thought I was still the daughter who desperately wanted a seat at the table. They didn't realize I had already bought the restaurant. The silence stretched thin and brittle as old glass. Then Scott slammed his hand on the table again, rattling the silverware. "I'm talking to you, Olivia. Did you hear me? We need those funds moved by Monday. If you're not willing to help your sister, if you're going to hoard this windfall like a miser while your family struggles, then you can get out. You're no daughter of mine." "Yeah," Brittany chimed in, her voice dripping with scorn. "You're just jealous because I'm actually going to be famous. You can't handle that I'm the one with the vision. You're just the bank, Liv. Get over it." I looked at them. Really looked at them. My father, red-faced and blustering, a man who had squandered every opportunity he'd ever been given. My sister, cruel and vapid, convinced the world owed her a living. And my mother watching me with cold calculation, already spending my money in her head. "Okay," I said. My voice was calm, almost bored. "I'll leave." I stood up, grabbed my iPad, and walked out the door. The cold November air hit my face like a slap, sharp and invigorating. I walked to my car, got in, and drove away. I didn't look back. I drove straight to my office, a climate-controlled warehouse on the edge of the city. Inside it was quiet, peaceful, rows of wooden crates stacked to the ceiling, millions of dollars in liquid assets resting in the dark. This was my sanctuary. This was my real home. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The blue light of the screen illuminated my face. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I felt a strange, cold clarity. For 2 years, I had been the invisible pillar holding up their house of cards. I had set up a shell company, Vitus Holdings, and through it I had been anonymously paying their mortgage, their credit card bills, their car leases. $15,000 a month, $360,000 in total. I had done it out of duty. Out of some misguided hope that if I kept them safe, they might one day learn to value me. But they hadn't learned. They had just gotten hungrier. I logged into the Vitus Holdings account. I navigated to the recurring payments tab. There it was, the auto pay for my parents' mortgage, for Brittany's business expenses, for the lease on Scott's luxury sedan. I moved the cursor to the Terminate All button. I didn't hesitate. I didn't waver. I clicked. "Are you sure you want to cancel all recurring payments? This action cannot be undone." "Yes," I whispered. "I'm sure." The screen refreshed. Status canceled. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus, my lawyer. It was late, but he answered on the second ring. Olivia, everything okay? Initiate phase 2, I said. Send the notice. Are you sure? Marcus asked, his voice cautious. Once we do this, there's no going back. They'll know. They wanted a return on their investment, I said, looking around at the silent, valuable rows of wine. I'm giving them exactly what they asked for. Liquidation. I hung up and opened a bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux. I poured a glass, swirled it, and took a sip. It tasted like victory. It tasted like freedom. My phone started buzzing on the desk, texts from my mother, likely alternating between guilt trips and threats. I didn't look at them. I turned the phone over and watched the dark liquid settle in the glass. The withdrawal had begun, and the hangover was going to be brutal. It took exactly 14 days for their reality to catch up with my math. I didn't have to watch it happen. I could track the collapse through the frantic notifications lighting up my phone like a slot machine paying out a jackpot of desperation. The first domino fell on a Tuesday. My father, Scott, tried to lease a new luxury sedan, the G-Wagon Brittany had demanded. He walked into the dealership with the swagger of a man who believed he was adjacent to $12 million. He walked out with a declined credit check and a humiliating Uber ride home. He didn't know that the lease payments on his current car had bounced that morning, triggering a cascade of defaults across his entire credit profile. The second domino was louder. Brittany's brand launch venue in Soho called. The deposit check drawn from the account I had been quietly funding for years had bounced. They didn't just cancel her reservation, they blacklisted her. She lost the venue, the caterer, and the deposit on the DJ who was supposed to launch her career. By Friday, the panic had set in. My phone was a war zone. Dozens of texts, voicemails, and emails flooded in, ranging from confusion to vitriol. The bank made a mistake, my mother texted, followed an hour later by, "Why aren't you answering? We need you to call the bank manager. They won't listen to us." They still didn't get it. They thought this was a clerical error. They thought the universe had simply glitched. They had lived in a subsidized reality for so long that they had forgotten what gravity felt like. They accused me of ruining Christmas not because I had stopped paying but because I hadn't stepped in to fix the glitch. They blamed my selfishness for the fact that their credit cards were suddenly made of plastic instead of magic. I didn't reply. I didn't even read the full messages. I was busy. While their world was imploding over declined appetizers and canceled parties, I was in my office wearing white cotton gloves holding a bottle of 1945 Romane Conti. It was one of only 600 bottles ever produced. The label was stained, the glass imperfect, but the liquid inside was worth more than the G-Wagon Brittany was crying about. I examined the ullage, the space between the cork and the wine. It was perfect. High shoulder, provenance verified. This single transaction would net me enough profit to buy their house twice over. But I wasn't buying houses today. I was finalizing the sale to a private collector in Singapore. Transfer confirmed, my assistant murmured from her desk. Funds are clearing now. I nodded, placing the bottle back into its velvet-lined case. Good. Lock it up. The contrast was intoxicating. In one world, my world, millions of dollars moved in silence, respectful and precise. In their world, chaos reigned because a credit card limit had been reached. They were screaming into the void, demanding to speak to the manager of their lives, never realizing that the manager had quit 2 weeks ago without notice. I checked my phone one last time before silencing it for the night. A text from Scott, "We're coming to the warehouse. We know you're there. You're going to fix this tonight, Olivia." I smiled. They were coming here, to my turf. They wanted to scream at the bank teller, fine. But they were about to discover that the bank was closed, and the vault was empty. And worse, they were about to learn who actually owned the building they were standing in. I poured myself a glass of water and waited. The paper tigers were coming to roar at the storm. They had no idea I was the one controlling the weather. The banging on the corrugated metal door wasn't a knock, it was an invasion. It echoed through the cavernous warehouse, vibrating against the racks of Pinot Noir and Cabernet. I didn't jump. I didn't rush. I finished logging the Singapore transaction, closed my laptop, and walked calmly to the entrance. I swiped my keycard, the lock disengaged with a heavy pneumatic hiss, and the heavy door rolled up. They stood there like refugees from a lifestyle magazine that had gone out of print. My father, Scott, looked disheveled, his face flushed with the kind of high blood pressure rage that usually preceded a bad financial decision. Susan was wringing her hands, her designer coat looking out of place in the industrial district. And Brittany, poor Brittany, was shivering in a crop top, looking at my warehouse, not with curiosity, but with disgust. They didn't wait to be invited. They stormed in their heels, clicking sharply on the concrete floor. "You think you can hide from us," Scott bellowed, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. "You think you can just turn off the tap and disappear? Do you have any idea what you've done? The bank called today, Olivia. They're threatening to freeze our accounts." "Actually," I said, leaning against a crate of 1990 Petrus worth $42,000, "I believe I turned off my tap. Your accounts are freezing because you spent money you didn't have." "It's family money," Susan shrieked, stepping forward. "It was a trust. You stole it." "It was a shell company," I corrected, my voice flat. "And the only person who put money into it was me. There is no trust. There is no inheritance. There is just my income, which I have generously allowed you to siphon for 24 months. That generosity has expired." Scott laughed, a harsh barking sound. He stepped into my personal space, trying to use his height to intimidate me. It didn't work. I had negotiated with sharks in Hong Kong and cutthroats in Bordeaux. A suburban dad in a leased Audi didn't scare me. "You think you hold all the cards," Scott sneered, pointing a finger in my face. "You think because you have a little cash you can dictate terms. We don't need you. We have assets. We have the house." He turned to Susan and Brittany, his eyes wild with a sudden desperate plan. "We'll sell the house," he announced as if he had just discovered fire. "The market is up. We have equity. We'll sell it, take the cash, and move into the city. We'll use the equity to fund Brittany's launch. We don't need her charity." He looked back at me, triumphant. "You hear that I'm putting it on the market tomorrow. I'll take every dime of equity, and you won't see a single penny. You'll be cut out completely." I looked at him, and for a moment I almost felt pity. Almost. It was fascinating to watch them operate under such a fundamental misconception. They were suffering from a delusion common among the entitled. They confused occupancy with ownership. They thought that because their pictures were on the walls, because their keys turned in the locks, and because they slept in the beds, they possessed the foundation. But possession is a legal term, not a feeling. They thought living there made them the lords of the manor. They forgot to check who actually held the paper. They were paper tigers roaring about territory they didn't actually control, threatening to burn down a forest they were merely renting. "You can't sell the house, Dad," I said softly. "Watch me," he shouted, turning toward the door. "I'm calling the realtor right now." "You can't sell it," I repeated, my voice cutting through his bluster like a diamond cutter through glass. I reached into my leather portfolio on the desk and pulled out a blue folder. "Because you don't own it." Scott froze. "What are you talking about? I've lived there for 30 years. "You lived there," I said, walking toward him, the folder heavy in my hand. "But 3 years ago, when the bank was foreclosing on you because you leveraged the equity to pay for Brittany's first influencer tour, you didn't save it. You defaulted." I held the folder out to him. "I bought the debt," I said. "Open it." Scott's hands shook as he opened the blue folder. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't help himself. He stared at the document on top, a deed of trust, stamped, notarized, and recorded with the county clerk. "Vitus Holdings, LLC," he read, his voice trembling. He looked up at me, confusion warring with fear in his eyes. "Who is Vitus Holdings? Who are you paying?" "I don't pay Vitus Holdings, Dad," I said, stepping closer until I was looming over the desk. "I am Vitus Holdings." The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and suffocating. It was the sound of a worldview shattering. Susan let out a small, strangled gasp. Brittany stopped shivering and just stared, her mouth slightly open. "You," Scott stammered, looking from the paper to me and back again. "You own the house." "I own the note you defaulted on," I corrected, my voice cool and clinical. "I own the title you forfeited 3 years ago when you missed 6 consecutive payments because you were funding Brittany's networking trip to Coachella. The bank was days away from auctioning it off on the courthouse steps." I stepped in. I bought the distressed debt for pennies on the dollar because no one else wanted a property with a leaking roof and occupants who refused to maintain the equity. I walked around the desk and stood next to him, pointing at the signature line on the deed. "I didn't tell you because I knew you'd hate me for saving you. I knew your ego couldn't handle the fact that your failure of a daughter was the only reason you weren't sleeping in your car, so I let you pretend. I let you play lord of the manor while I quietly paid the property taxes, the insurance, and the repairs. But the monthly payments," Susan whispered, her face pale. "The money you sent." "Rent," I said. "Subsidized below-market rent that I paid to myself to keep the illusion alive. I was moving money from my left pocket to my right pocket just to keep a roof over your heads. But you didn't see it as a lifeline. You saw it as a salary. You thought you were entitled to it." Scott dropped the folder onto the desk as if it were burning his hands. the fight had drained out of him instantly. He wasn't the powerful patriarch anymore. He was just a tenant who had annoyed the landlord. He looked small, he looked old. "You can't sell the house, Dad," I said, driving the final nail in. "Because you have zero equity. You have zero ownership. You are a guest who has overstayed their welcome." I reached into the folder and pulled out 2 stapled documents. I laid them side by side on the mahogany desk. "Option A," I said, tapping the document on the left. "A standard residential lease agreement. 1 year. Market rate for a 4-bedroom home in your zip code is $8,500 a month. First and last month's rent due at signing. No subletting, no unauthorized business headquarters for Brittany." Brittany let out a sob, a ugly wet sound. She realized her lifestyle wasn't just paused, it was deleted. "Or option B," I said, tapping the document on the right. "A notice to quit. Eviction. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. You take your furniture, your clothes, and your ego, and you leave my property." I looked at them, my family, the people I had tried so hard to protect, the people who had tried to bleed me dry. "You wanted a return on your investment," I said. "Here it is. Choose." Scott looked at the papers. He looked at me. For the first time in my life, I didn't see disappointment in his eyes. I saw fear. He realized that the power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. He wasn't the head of the household. He was a line item on my balance sheet. And I was the one holding the red pen. "Monday," I said, closing the folder and handing it back to him. "I expect your decision by 9 o'clock in the morning on Monday. If I don't hear from you, I'll assume you chose option B, and the sheriff will be there on Tuesday." I walked to the warehouse door and pressed the button. The metal sheet rattled as it began to rise, revealing the cold, dark night outside. "Now," I said, not looking back, "get out of my warehouse." 3 months after the warehouse door rattled shut, I stood in a different kind of quiet. This silence didn't smell like damp concrete and potential. It smelled like earth, ancient stone, and morning rain. I was standing in the middle of a vineyard in Burgundy, France. The air was crisp, biting my cheeks, but the sun was warm on my back. I walked down the rows of vines, running my fingers over the rough sleeping wood. This was mine. Not a shell company, not a debt note, but this soil. I had finalized the purchase a week after the eviction. They chose option B, of course. My father's pride wouldn't let him pay rent to his daughter, and his bank account wouldn't have allowed it anyway. They moved out on the 29th day. They stripped the house of everything that wasn't nailed down: light fixtures, curtain rods, even the copper piping from the guest bathroom sink. Petty vandalism disguised as moving out. It didn't matter. I sold the empty shell as is to a developer for a cash offer that covered my original investment plus 40%. Scott and Susan downsized to a 2-bedroom condo in a complex 40 minutes outside the city. I heard from a cousin that Scott spends his days complaining to the HOA board, trying to exert authority over the placement of garbage cans because he has no authority left anywhere else. Brittany is working retail at a mall kiosk. She blocked me on Instagram, but not before sending a long, rambling manifesto about how I had stolen her youth. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I scrolled to the contact group labeled Family. There were only 3 names in it: Scott, Susan, Brittany. I didn't feel anger anymore. The rage that had fueled me for years, the desperate need to prove them wrong, to show them I was worthy, it had evaporated the moment I handed them that eviction notice. They were just people now. Flawed, small, unhappy people who had mistaken my silence for weakness. I pressed select all. Then I pressed delete. "Are you sure you want to delete these contacts? This action cannot be undone." "Yes," I whispered to the vines. "I'm sure." The screen cleared. The weight in my chest, a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying, finally lifted. I put the phone away and looked out over the valley. The vines were dormant now, pruned back hard for the winter. To an untrained eye, they looked dead. But I knew better. I knew that you have to cut away the dead wood, the suckers, the branches that take but never give, to ensure the fruit will be sweet in the coming season. I had pruned my life, and for the first time I was ready to grow. Sometimes you have to prune the vine to save the harvest. Have you ever had to cut off someone you loved to save yourself? Tell me your story in the comments, and if you enjoyed this victory, hit follow for more stories of justice served.